Resilience. The distinguished speakers here will cover almost every aspect of the world, so we will not confine our discussions to just natural disasters, but we will talk about every possible kind of shock that we anticipate by looking back to the few major shocks that the world has faced and see how some of the countries have coped with them. And then we will use our crystal balls from the experts here to look into the future and see whether we can detect and prevent possible shocks. With me on the stage are some of the most distinguished experts in various fields. I'll start with the President and CEO of PT Garuda Indonesia, Emirsyah Satar. Then Harman, Director, President, and CEO of Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, USA. Followed by Minister of Office of Prime Minister's Office, Malaysia, Idris Jala. And member of Group Executive Committee and Regional Chairman for Asia Pacific, Middle East, and Africa, Mr. Geoff Riddell. Then Deputy Managing Director of IMF Washington, D.C., now Yuki Shinohara. And President of Fujitsu Japan, Masami Yamamoto. He's also co-chair of the World Economic Forum on East Asia. Obviously, the most obvious shock that has hit us in the past few years and still remains the most dangerous spot is Fukushima in Japan. I will start by asking Mr. Yamamoto to tell us how Japan is coping with Fukushima, whether the problem is under control, and how can the whole world look at Japan again? And I've asked the members on the panel to just cut in any time they want instead of going by order of speakers, because that would be too boring for you. So you will see, I'll try to make this a very lively, interesting conversation rather than just a panel discussions. So Yamamoto, Fukushima.
I speak sorry Japanese. 3月11日に起きた東日本大震災で日本は大きな被害を受けました。一つは津波による多くの人が失われたこと、そして福島の原子力発電が破壊したことであります。その中で我々は2つのことを学んでいます。一つは自然災害に対するレジリアントをどうするか。
Learned about how to handle and cope with the natural disasters, as well as how to manage the supply chain that was disrupted as a result. This is a major impact, and this kind of incident was also experienced here in Thailand as well last year as the result of the major flood. And we have to come up with the innovative approach to cope and minimize the impact of the disasters. How can we minimize the impact on the global supply chain, and how do we manage the supply chain? This is the task before the global community. I personally, as a IC vendor, and we felt the impact significantly and had to look for solutions to cope with this kind of natural disasters. For example, if we look at natural disasters, when it strikes like a tsunami, before it arrived at the shore, we probably know, the question we ask is, do we know the height of the wave? Can we create a simulation of the tsunami? We can employ the modern state-of-the-art technology to create a simulation of this kind of natural disasters so that we can mobilize the resources to increase and enhance our preparedness so that we can cope with the impact, and then we can share our knowledge and lesson learned with the rest of the world community. And when we look at the impact on the supply chain, when we're talking about products, manufactured products, we know that ASEAN and Southeast Asia is a major manufacturing base for Japanese companies. And we need to look at how we can find substitutes for supplies of semi-manufactured goods. And we are running simulation and to come up with models to run for simulations in the future.
Geoff, do you think Japan has coped with it well enough from your perspective?
Yeah, I think Japan has displayed resilience, and I think, in fact, we can extend that and say East Asia has shown great resilience to all sorts of shocks over the last 10 to 15 years. In Japan, the wonderful stoicism and reaction of the people helped prevention of panic and showed how a well-prepared, orderly community can respond to a great disaster. Mr. Yamamoto-san has talked about the lessons we learnt about supply chains, and I'll touch on that briefly in a second. I think we saw three issues coming out of the Great Sendai quake, which was that however much preparation is done, nature can overwhelm that preparation, and we need to be ready and need to train people to deal with that. We saw that however much we try to protect settlements from natural disaster when the issues are known, that's not always enough. We saw the supply chain issues that Mr. Yamamoto discussed, but we also saw the flaws in nuclear power, and that may be the single great, I think there are great legacies coming out of the Sendai quake, but the greatest legacy may be the challenges that the power industry now faces, and how is that dealt with in a world that's very conscious of greenhouse gases and the effects of conventional power. So we're going to have to adjust to all of that. Asia has shown that when it gets shocks, it can cope with them. Some of that is that East Asia is a growth economy and so is able to respond. From the Asian financial crisis through to the 2008 global financial crisis, Asia has dealt with these issues much better than anybody ever thought it would do. With the Indonesian tsunami in 2005, we saw rapid recovery. We saw, again, resilience in action. We saw the recovery to SARS. We've seen Thailand cope with an unprecedented flood. So it's spread over to industry, it's spread over to the communities, but the fundamental dynamics of East Asia have shown that there is a resilience. The challenge that we're being asked to discuss is how do we take that resilience to the next level?
Jan?
Well, I'm a recovering politician, having served 9 terms in the United States Congress, and now I head the Wilson Center. In terms of looking at policy, I think this issue is much broader than one crisis in Japan as big as it was, or even one flood in Thailand as big as it was. I come from California, where the 4 seasons are fire, floods, earthquakes, and riots. And I would add terrorism or potential terrorism to that list and say that those seasons apply here too. And it may be true that Asia has recovered well. Certainly the economy here is booming. In fact, I personally contributed to it yesterday. I want applause for that. But I think Asia could have done better in some ways. I know that my country could have done much better with respect to Hurricane Katrina, for one, or with respect to 9/11. We were underprepared for both of those shocks. And I think our challenge is, as a global economy, because, for example, if the Eurozone should have, and I'm sure we'll hear about this in a moment, more trouble than it is already having, that will carry around the globe. I think our challenge is, as a region, and as a global economy, to find ways to work together better to do these things. First of all, to the maximum extent to prevent these things from happening. And there are ways not to prevent everything, but certainly there are ways to prevent terror attacks, and there may be ways by housing codes and other things to prevent the impact of certain things. Prevention first, preparation and training second, and then consequence management third. And I think all of these areas need work, and all of us need to work together through ASEAN and through other means to do better in the future.
Emma, if you compare the tsunami in Indonesia with Fukushima, do you see any similarities, any differences?
I think it's a bit, well, tsunami, but I mean, I think the impact is a bit different, yeah. But I think the key thing is, I mean, there must be a coordination, a cooperation in any disaster between the government and the business itself. I would say in Fukushima, I think because, I mean, there's a lot of big businesses there, you know, it's the involvement of the businesses is quite much, you know, compared to Indonesia. Probably the governments are more involved. But one thing is most important in these things, especially Indonesia. You know, we are like in the ring of fire.
Yep.
There is also traditional education, which is being done also. I mean, being educated, the people also is very important, which is done usually by the government. I mean, there's an island there, and the last tsunami, there's an island. Whereas from all their ancestors, you know, whenever they see feel an earthquake, they all go to the mountains, you know. They just educate them. So when that happened, you know, that island, there was no casualties. So I think it's between the government and the business who will, you know, build the resilience. Plus, you know, it's very important that you educate the people.
Yeah.
In terms of what happens and everything, and what reactions. And the government's function is just to monitor and make sure that they do that in place. You know.
Idris?
Yeah. Malaysia, we're quite fortunate. We did not have for quite some time natural shocks or disasters as you see around us, because we're in the center of that ring of fire, if you like. But let me return to the broader subject of how do we build resilience in the face of risks of extreme shocks of all sorts. So there are two words there, two R. First one is resilience, the other R is risks of those shocks. I'm of the view that if you have a strong and solid economy, very strong and solid economy, it's a foundation to enable you to have the means to deal with the shock. So I do believe within the EA region, all countries must become strong economically. How do you become strong economically? We have to have focus. You cannot pretend to be good in every sector. In my view, you should take about 6 to 10 big areas where you really put your resources so that you become economically very solid in those areas. And secondly, all countries will become strong if we create the conditions for competitiveness to flourish in all the economies. So you need to put in all the interventions, such as putting in place competition law, putting in place liberalization, putting in place the right standards. So if you do that, you build then economically a very strong economy. Then the rest is about cooperation between nations, connectivity between nations, so that we're all wired community. In the event we need each other's help. I think beyond that, it is important to figure out how we can, as a group in EA, for example, consider what are some of the basic areas where we will provide help to our neighbors when it happens to them. At some point, it could happen to us too. I don't know how do we come with a discussion around whether it's what form, is it a monetary help or is it a physical help, in what form? What's the basic requirement required? So if we say at level 1, this is what we all put. At level 2, this is what we all put. If it's level 3, we will put this. So we'll agree upfront. Those are the things that I would say when you already have it. But I think creating a solid economy so that you have a foundation, economically you can tackle that, is absolutely key for EA. So building resilience, I believe, is the economy, and the connectivity and the helping oneself, everybody as a group through collaboration.
Well, ASEAN has been talking about a common approach to coping with shocks. What specific examples can you cite as to connectivity, the speed with which you can go into a certain area to help? As an ASEAN task force, how do you do it?
Let's take an example. And some of us remember SARS. It affected quite a number of us, not everybody, but some more intense than others. There were questions about what do we do as a group with regards to allowing people to travel?
Yes.
And do we close our borders? Do we then allow this and that? I mean, we were doing it in patches. We have not figured out what to do with flow of people between and trade too. And so there clearly, we need to upfront prepare for all of those things. So if it is a health scare, either it's SARS or any other form of pandemic, then we should say these are what we will necessarily know at level 1 and level 2. Before it even comes. You know, if we don't prepare as a group and when it comes, then we're all running around. You know, when everybody is running around, the tendency is, I then put barriers so that you don't come here. And that's if you like, the natural response. Please help yourself, I'm stuck here. But I think right before, when everybody is cool and relaxed, we put a cool towel on the head. And then we then prepare for upfront as a community, what do we do? And so I think, to my mind, you cannot leave it until the day itself. Because when it happens, I mean, you're running around. You're now responding to the spur of the moment rather than well calculated and well planned and sought out community response to it.
Is that kind of preemptive move in place now in ASEAN?
I don't think so.
What should we do about it?
I think ASEAN should come together and, as I said, list down the major kind of shocks that are there, provide a framework within which we will help one another when it happens. And if it means money, commit to put money to it. Then until you are on the road to doing something concrete. Otherwise, we will be talking about this for a long time.
Yes.
And it's the same stuff when it happens. Everybody is helping, doing their thing. And we've seen it many times before. And it always what happened is humanitarian aids come through. That is out of the goodwill of particular countries that will grant the assistance. I think we should be mature enough to say, in a world where we will be facing a lot more shocks in the future, maybe we should start planning rather than reacting.
So Shinohara, in economic terms, the shocks in the past few years throughout the world.
Yeah, I can only talk about economics. So I guess generally speaking, countries in this region has become quite resilient to external shocks. I mean, if you compare the situation with that during the Asian financial crisis, for example, the corporate sector has become quite strong. If you look at debt-to-equity ratio, it has been reduced by 2/3. So the company's leverage has been reduced substantially. And if you look at the banks and other financial institutions, their balance sheet has been strengthened quite a lot. The dependency on the foreign funding has been reduced. And potential currency mismatches has been reduced in the sense that foreign currency lending to domestic sector by those banks has been reduced substantially. So those are very good. And at the same time, if you look at the fiscal and monetary policy, there is ample policy buffer at this moment to cope with the potential shocks that might come from outside. If you look at the trade sector, intra-regional trade, that is the trade within the region, has increased substantially. Over the past 10 years, intra-regional trade has increased increased 3 times,
Yes.
while the global trade increased just twice. So that means that intra-regional trade is increasing very rapidly. That itself is good. But if you look at the situation in more detail, you can find risks, because the main factor contributing to the increase in intra-regional trade is intermediate goods, capital goods, exported by some of the ASEAN countries in Asia to other countries in Asia. So that means that the countries in this region has established a very strong supply chain, but the final demand still comes from outside Asia. The final demand still comes from the US or Europe and other regions. So these days we all talk about the potential re-escalation of the European financial crisis, or the persistent housing problem in the United States. If those serious situation escalates, that will certainly have major impacts on the Asian region through trade channels. As I said, intra-regional trade is increasing, but the final demand is still outside Asia. So countries in this region should not be complacent about what has happened over the 10 years and be prepared for potential shocks.
Is Asia resilient enough to withstand the shock of a Eurozone breakup?
That's very difficult to respond. We are not expecting Euro to break up.
Shock, extreme shock we're talking about.
Extreme shock. In case of the extreme shock, I think through trade channel, there will be a substantial impact on Asia. As I said, still the final demand comes from outside Asia. That means that, the countries in this region are still dependent on demands coming from outside Asia. So significant impact would be felt by the countries in this region as well. And also, we have to worry about the financial linkage between the countries in Asia and, for example, in Europe. There are many European banks that are active in this region, especially in the trade sector, trade financing, and also corporate project financing. So if there is a huge stress in Europe, I think the major impact would be felt in the trade financing area, and over the medium term in project financing area as well.
I'm sure within the IMF headquarters, you must have played with scenarios. Worst case scenario of a sudden breakup of Eurozone, medium shock, perhaps not total breakdown, but Greece leaving Eurozone. Best case scenario, just dragging on for a few more years. What would be the most likely scenario in IMF own calculation? And how do we cope with each of the scenarios?
I think the best way to respond to you is that, well, there are several things that I should talk about here. One, we are not expecting Greece to exit from Euro. It is very costly. And of course, there is an election coming in mid-June in Greece, and we have to wait and see what happens at the election. But we are not expecting Greece to exit from Euro. And of course, IMF has a responsibility to, to try to find solutions to all the scenarios. But that is as far as I can go at this moment. But over the medium term, I think what we should expect is that slower growth, slower global growth will continue for the time being. Fiscal consolidation will continue in advanced economies, and every year for the next several years, the impact of the fiscal consolidation will be probably around 1% of the GDP. So that means that fiscal consolidation that is necessary for European countries will shape off the global growth by 1%, whatever the scenario you assume.
And you can't just isolate Europe and Asia. There's a big landmass in between called the United States and actually called North America and South America, all of which will be impacted too. There are extreme weather patterns here, obviously, also in the United States. European weather's different too. So, and there is this highly dispersed, perhaps less lethal, but still very serious terror threat all around the world. I was here about 10 years ago when the terrorist who blew up the hotels in Bali was very effectively arrested by the Thai enforcement authorities. Hambali was his name. And my point is that all of this stuff could compound, and these threats are not just one at a time. They could come at the same time. So setting up some form of ranking for problems is a good idea. Setting aside currency to deal with them is a good idea. But I think resilience, which will directly impact the world economy, requires even more. And I think it requires getting individual publics prepared. Each country is different, trained to know what to do, hopefully to find out, again, I'm thinking about terrorism, to find things out before they happen so that they can be disrupted. But this problem is not going to be taken care of in any effective way, I don't believe, by just a few people, not just at this World Economic Forum, but in capitals around the world, making these decisions. These decisions have to go down to the grassroots level because these problems could happen anywhere.
Jane, Jane, can the United States be expected to lead the world in building resilience of extreme shocks, terrorism, another big natural disaster, or a breakup of Eurozone? Can the United States still play that role?
Well, I think the United States must lead to the extent we're able to. We have been helpful. We could be even more helpful in this region with respect to responding to some of the horrific natural disasters. I would argue that our best foreign policy in recent years is the way we help other nations respond to natural disasters. U.S. poll numbers are pretty low around the world. They go up geometrically when we respond to disasters, and Americans are inherently generous and want to do this. But we must lead. We have problems in the United States that are common here, and we have the resources to provide, to be a partner with ASEAN, and to be a partner, obviously, with the IMF, and to be a partner with other regional organizations in dealing with this. And again, I see this as probably the most important threat. Resilience, the lack of resilience, is the most important threat to the global economy.
Geoff?
I think, Mr. Chairman, this is the point where I can do a plug for the World Economic Forum. One of the publications of the World Economic Forum is the Global Risk Report. That Global Risk Report is put together by the WEF and its multiple partners. I may be biased that we're one of the people that have input to it, but in fact what it shows is something that many of the panelists have talked about, is it identifies risks, but it also shows how heavily interconnected they are. If you've not read that, I suggest everybody here should look at it. It's scary when you see just how interconnected everything is and how one risk can trigger others. The two biggest risks it sees for 2012 are gaps between rich and poor and fiscal instability, but its biggest worry in terms of size and impact is a further systemic financial disaster. And it's Yeah, the echoes of that seem pretty powerful at the moment. Just to follow up with what James is saying is, in order to build resilience, we have to do 4 things. There's other panels today have talked about the need to recognize, mitigate, respond, and recover whenever something happens. I don't think we're good enough as a world at any of the 4. We need to get better at all 4. And I think Jane was hitting on an issue there just now. If we're going to get better at all 4, we need leadership. Global leadership isn't where it needs to be today. And ASEAN +3 can help that, as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman. But I think we need more than that globally, and we've got to see people ready to step up and be global leaders.
Mr. Yamamoto, what role can Japan play in a global threat, either it's natural disaster or terrorism?
今、経済のリスクの話がありましたけれど、従来型の経済のリスクっていうのは地域経済のリスク、例えばヨーロッパが悪くなった、アメリカが悪くなった、中国が悪くなった、こういう経済的なリスクで、どこかが逆に良くなると、世界の経済が良くなるっていうのが今あるんです。
the United States of America.
私はその経済を引っ張っていくのは新しいイノベーションが引っ張っていく。例えば
In one place,
スマートフォン
we'll make changes in another area. What we need is new innovations. For example, smartphone. Smartphone will also can expand our economic activities. At the same time, it will increase the level of connectivity, so the successful economies can help the inferior economies to regain their balance. So this is an important issue, and Japan can contribute ourselves, at least in creating innovations in order to make the economic world rebound.
Mr. Idris, it seems that some of the panelists are not too confident that ASEAN can really handle a major shock that could happen anytime.
I think ASEAN is relatively resilient. And I believe that if there was quite a major thing that's happening in the Eurozone, it will impact ASEAN, but not as scary as most people think. And the reason why I say that is the following. If you look at most economies in ASEAN, take Malaysia as a good example, 70% of our GDP is domestic consumption. 22% of our GDP is investment. And then only 7% is actually trade, net trade. And so it's very small, if you like. So if you look at directly what's happening in Europe, obviously will impact our net trade. Our export will go down relative to our imports. But nevertheless, the lion's share of our economy is still domestic consumption. That's 70%. And then 20%, 22% of our GDP is actually investment, mainly private investment. Now, so if I return to the issue around resilience, the more exposed an economy is to the global world in terms of trade, then the more you become, obviously, susceptible to extreme shocks that are happening in that sector. The less exposed you are to it, obviously, you could say you're more resilient. The problem with that is this. If you are autarkic in your approach, very clearly looking at only expanding your goods and services within your own borders, it's very difficult to become a high-income economy. And it's because you need to move out into the market outside. So most countries like Malaysia, we are a middle-income economy today. We're desiring to become a high-income economy by the year 2020. It is quite clear that we will have to make sure products and services can win it out there in the international market. The more we do that, the more we expose ourselves to extreme shocks globally. I would say ASEAN today, many countries in ASEAN are in a position that we are still relatively, if you like, sheltered, because most of the countries in ASEAN, the majority of their GDP is still domestic consumption. But there will come a time when they will become a high-income nation, and then they will then be exposed because their products and services are sent abroad. So when you can't trade, then obviously you get hit. And so I would say today, if you ask me point blank the question, how resilient is ASEAN to a global shock that is happening from the Eurozone? Very resilient. But to say that we will not be impacted, not true. We will be impacted. And why so? Because most of us are middle income and developing income and not so exposed in terms of net trade. So I believe today we are in a position to get ready, put things in order. One of the key lessons learned in Europe and even in the States is that it is very important that countries cannot go to what's called unbridled growth, borrowing a lot of money well ahead of your size of your GDP. And so if you have government debt at 100% of the size of your GDP, then you've got a lot of issues associated with that. And so countries must learn to make sure that you borrow money in proportion to the size of your GDP. In fact, in Malaysia, we have a law that prohibits us from borrowing more than 55% of our GDP. And so how you can become like Greece so that the debt becomes 100% of the GDP? I think there are things you can do internally to put some checks and control so that you don't have unbridled growth, that you got seduced by the flow of investments into the economy, and then therefore you don't put the fences to put controls in the system. And so I do believe that intelligently, ASEAN need to learn from what's happening in the rest of the world in this respect.
But on the one hand, we are going to become AEC in 3 years' time. We're going to be more interdependent. And that means we're more exposed. That means that the shocks will hit us more widely in terms of the overall impact.
Yeah.
So if you say Malaysia is okay because it's only 7% of its trade is related to outside market, Mr. Shinohara doesn't seem to agree. He says that, the external demand decides our economy. But at the same time, you say we are almost insulated. ASEAN is not that exposed, but we are moving towards
We're moving towards that.
That means the risk is getting
The risk is
higher.
there. Sure.
Or should we stall?
Yeah.
Or should we move forward? What would be the policy?
I think clearly you must not stall. I made reference before, Malaysia's middle income. We want to be a high income. But by doing so, our proportion of net trade must rise to be much higher than where it is today. By doing so, when you reach that point, you clearly become exposed. Mm-hmm. And so when you look today, and we've said that by the year 2015, ASEAN will open its doors, must have greater connectivity. And clearly that will allow more trade flows between the countries. And when that happens, there is a lot more propensity and much higher risk in terms of exposure. So what I'm saying is that between now and 2015, we got time to figure out what we needed to do. So the points that I think Geoff made reference to before, we could have a caucus if we were to say, okay, why don't we have a natural disaster fund for an argument's sake? People can contribute, every country as the size of their GDP and also propensity to strikes or to calamities or extreme shocks. That's their net contribution every year. So we put that money there. So when something happens within the frame, then that money can be given to the country that is suffering from such a shock. But I mean, if you just do it on the basis of, charity, very difficult to raise a charity just when you are there having the difficulties. I think charity is fine, but I mean, being prepared upfront to put money in a fund, I don't know, something like that, just an idea.
So we should do it now.
Idris, you just went through one of the things that the Global Risk Report says. As you go up, you drive the inexorable increase in the interconnectivity of risk.
Sure.
You're more exposed to others' risks, but you also will create other risks for others because you're buying from them. Mm-hmm. So we have this inexorable move to greater interconnectivity of risk.
Emir, is ASEAN ready to move forward more connectivity at the same time being more exposed?
I guess, Indonesia and Malaysia, I think, Indonesia, we're only 22%, our GDPs depend on export. Our consumption, domestic consumption, which is driving the economy. I think when you talk about this connectivity, the idea of this connectivity, basically, you're trying to bring the whole nation the same level. which ASEAN is trying to do now. And I think what we've learned in what happened in the Euro, basically, it seems like certain countries is not very disciplined in terms of what they're supposed to do. So I guess first, I do agree what Idris is saying is basically, I mean, the more you grow your economy, because the stronger the economy, you're basically right now, it's interconnected. So anyway, you will be affected. But I guess right now the issue is the level is how strong is your economy in terms of the region, in terms of how soon will it affect, And again, I guess I can say in Indonesian case, during the 2008, during the global crisis, when we see that coming, between the government and the businesses, we sat together in terms of seeing what we're supposed to do. And I think almost the same, like in any natural disaster or any hits that you're gonna go, you better sit down together with the government. So make sure that the government and the businesses is in accordance what they're doing, because you see that tsunami is coming. So I think the key thing is we need to be prepared and make sure that all the countries are in the same level, act the same way, which is difficult. I mean, even in Europe, it's more advanced countries, but very difficult. And those are the risks that ASEAN will see in terms of getting this connectivity. And I
Government,
guess
private sector, which part do you think would be more effective in mobilizing a preemptive fund? I mean, the fund that should be started now instead of waiting for things to happen. Do you think the private sector could move faster? Because you don't expect the governments to commit themselves so early in the process.
usually businesses is faster.
Well, you have the minister here and you have the Garuda CEO here. Who would act faster?
I mean, in my experience, it's always the businesses. It's business.
What about the government? Why is the government so slow?
I think the government can move fast if we put up a law and say everybody must contribute. And if you say pass a law and say all businesses must contribute, this is the form of contribution, just like any tax.
Tax deductibility.
Yeah, put tax deductibility and put it there in the fund. So when you put it down like that, you see the difficulty today is why it's so difficult. Is because it's not urgent and not important on the list in the way we see as community. Everybody is interested in their own little patch. I look after my own thing and somebody else look after their thing. It's only when the problem arises, then you say, we wish we had something else other than this. And so that tends to be the difficulty. But if we as a global community or as a regional community agree this is the right thing to do, and if you then say the rule moving forward is to put a form of a tax to deduct it from everybody to go inside there. There's enough money to go around, I think.
Yeah, Jen?
You need both. You need a totally involved private sector. You need to do what Mr. Yamamoto said, which is to have the private sector contribute technologies like smartphones, advanced sensors, cutting-edge medicines which are pre-positioned, and things of this kind against all forms of shocks. And then you need the private sector lashed to the government response effort so that everyone is in. I mean, one of the problems that at least I've seen very closely in the United States is that different spheres operate separately. And in the end, what happens is the response is inefficient. Katrina's a very good example of that. We didn't have the layers of government put together, and we didn't have the private sector in. We did not take advantage of all kinds of resources that were readily available to be deployed and weren't deployed. And I'm sure that was true to some extent through all the disasters here too. So if we see these shocks as global, and I think we have to, certainly because the economy is global and shocks anywhere are shocks everywhere, then I think lashing up the private and public sectors and using the the ingenuity and inventions of the private sector effectively across the globe, and especially in Asia, where there are many clever and interesting entrepreneurs, then I think we have the best chance of being ready and, again, hopefully being prepared and having the least consequences to manage after the fact.
Geoff, in your report, is that question addressed?
Yes.
How do you really get a global response task force ready for any big disaster?
Two things. I think Jane's exactly right. When you see major events, the plethora of responses becomes chaotic, and Haiti is actually the worst example of that. Just to go back to private versus government funding, I represent an industry that's a major provider of contingent funding for catastrophes.
Insurance.
And insurance can do much more if people are persuaded to buy more. A large amount of Japan's exposure was uninsured because there was a feeling that earthquake was uninsurable but in many ways. All of the major events we've talked about could have had much greater private insurance in place. And we've got to try and mobilize that money in a better way. That still wouldn't have helped Haiti because it was too poor to have ever created any insurance payments. So there is a role in all of it. Government is, in the terms we use in the insurance industry, government is the ultimate reinsurer. They have to pay what goes through the limits and what was uninsured. And government needs to be ready to do that and needs to continually work with commerce and the insurance sector and the public to try and balance that out. In terms of how we respond, the WEF is doing a lot of good work in trying to get prioritization of responses and get people in place. I could talk on this for hours. There's a lot of really good stuff happening. I get caught up with the issue I mentioned before. There isn't global leadership. Without global leadership, there can be a lot of good work and a lot of stuff done, but it doesn't get the opportunity to respond as it wants.
So Shinhara, does IMF have a contingency plan for possible shocks in the future?
As I said, we have to work on all possible scenarios. I mean, that is the only thing I can say about the current situation.
You mean you have some predictions of possible shocks, but you cannot tell the public about it yet?
We are having serious discussions inside the organization on various options. But how can I talk about those things in the public forum?
Well, you can give us some hint so that we are not too shocked when the shock comes.
May I change the subject a little bit?
Well, as long as it's interesting, go ahead.
I mean, I just want to talk a little bit about the regional efforts.
Yes.
I think it is very important. I talked about the resilience of the countries in this region, which is much stronger than before, but there are still risks, and we have to face those possibilities. And that is all I wanted to say at the beginning. There are lots of regional efforts ongoing, and I think which will further strengthen the resilience of the economies in this region. For example, ASEAN +3 has initiated the so-called Chiang Mai initiative. That is the regional safety net to cope with the situations. ASEANs are working on integrating financial markets. Deepening of the financial markets in this region will certainly strengthen the resilience of this region by deepening the financial markets and providing more resources, financial resources to the consumers and the corporate sector. I think what is important, simply put, is the domestic growth. I mean, the minister talked about the consumption, the strong consumption that is important to cope with the external shocks. So strong domestic growth is very important. How to promote the domestic sector, domestic demand-led growth. I think that is the key question that we will have to think about over the medium term.
Well, I was myself quite surprised that the world was so interdependent when the heavy flood took place in Thailand. Suddenly, we discovered that Thailand was a center of production of a lot of parts for computers, for all sorts of electronic goods. And suddenly, when the flood hit for a few weeks, the whole supply chain stopped virtually around the world. Japan, Taiwan, even the United States, the factories were not working because they were waiting for parts from Thailand. So here you are, Minister, that we are talking about promoting local consumption as shock absorber, but at the same time, we are increasingly interdependent. Where is a proper balance? Who is going to decide where the line is drawn that is good for financial, economic security, and at the same time, to be able to build sufficient resilience against future shocks?
You need to do both, the A plus B. So the A must be, you need to grow. No question about needing to grow, as all countries would all like to be prosperous. But once you have the ability to accumulate wealth, it is very important, in my view, to take some of that wealth for a rainy day. So that's the difficulty. Most people said, we create wealth, but that wealth is used to create further wealth. You need to take some of that and put it in where you can then deal for a rainy day. And so I think if you put that there, and so mitigating that, I would say that, take the point that was raised earlier on about countries. And I take food, for example. Food is a very important issue about possible shocks. If, God forbid, there was something that really decimate production of rice or everything like that, then it will really be a catastrophic thing in this part of the world. And so, but if it is more pronounced in certain areas, I do believe that all countries should say who is good in what kind of the food chain. In our analysis, Malaysia, for example, we believe that on poultry, we are very good. Poultry farming, we are competitive, our prices are good, the quality of our chicken is good. On the reverse side, we're not very good in beef production. And we will never be able to be as good as New Zealand, for example, in doing so. And if that was the case, we will alienate a lot of our land for the production of chicken, rather than try very hard to alienate a lot of that land for beef. It's better that we connect with New Zealand and say, instead of us trying to do it, we then connect with them to get much more of that. So if we did open an envelope as a system, and we did what is, I said, focus on what is you are naturally endowed and good in, then I think the trade can be a lot more connected so that you then work on the strength of each other. But of course, when you start doing that, you need a portfolio. You can't have relying on beef from one country, but there must be another. I used to, in my old job, I used to work in the airlines, to the Emirsyah.
Yes.
In the airlines, everyone says that if you fly to an airport, you must always have a secondary airport. You must always. And there must always be enough fuel to take you from that airport. If there was that airport you cannot land, there must be enough fuel in the aircraft to lead you to that secondary airport.
Yes.
That's contingency. And there must be enough fuel, and you must already identify that secondary airport before the flight begins. The pilot knows this, and there's a third one, airport too. Now, I think nations must take this kind of approach. So you must have the contingency right up front before the flight begins.
Yes.
And so when it happens, then you're ready for it.
So we now have a second airport?
That's why I said you need a second airport.
We don't know yet. We don't know where that second airport
we need
is
to
yet.
create.
We need to create it. Okay, I throw the session to the floor. Questions? Yes? Please. Over here. Over there first. Over there. I saw the hand over there first.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Sutish. My question is to Ms. Harman. My name is Imtiaz Maqbal from Travel Impact Newswire. Ms. Harman, this relates to the issue of your comment on the low poll numbers of the United States and the question of leadership. In the last decade, many of your major multinational companies have gone bankrupt and have had to be bailed out. The country's economy is in a mess. Many people in this part of the world believe that your country is responsible for the emissions that have caused global warming. A war was started over weapons of mass destruction which were never found, and now you want to attack Iran. I'm trying to figure out which area of leadership do you feel yourself qualified to lead in?
Jane?
Yeah.
Tough question.
Well, I don't agree with everything you have said. I think that the American economy is quite resilient. Yes, we have high unemployment at the moment. Yes, we have not come up with a way forward on our budget deficit. Yes, we have too much partisanship, something that troubles me enormously, and each political party blames the other rather than working with the other party to solve the problems. Those are serious and real problems. On the other hand, and yes, our involvement in several wars, we don't have time to discuss them, but certainly the most potent at the moment in Afghanistan is an international effort involving NATO-led forces, has caused a strain on America's finances. But during all of this, as I mentioned, America has tried to lead, especially in this area, and has been generous in many parts of the world. And I think with respect to the natural disasters in Japan and most recently here with the floods, our ability to stage people and supplies into this area very quickly and our competence were widely respected. So I agree with you that we have many challenges in the United States, and certainly as someone who spent years and years and years and years in politics, I tried to do my best to solve some of them. But we, the U.S., must play a role going forward. This panel is about how will we do our best to avoid or respond to these shocks in the future. And I finally would say we can all do better, and there will be shocks. We can't make this problem go away. And America's leadership will be tested, but surely, regardless of who wins our presidential election, which needs to be over very soon, regardless of our next president, that president will show leadership here with respond to these problems.
Talking about future shock, Jane, who's going to win the election?
I'm sorry?
Who's going to win the election? Talking about
who's going to win the election? In political time, I think most of you know this, there are about 100 years between now and November. And the U.S. election will be impacted by the topics we're discussing.
Yes.
If there is a Eurozone collapse, if there is some military action in Iran, if there are new testing of weapons by North Korea, if there are very additional vicious natural disasters any place in the globe, including in our own country, all of which can happen before November, the result of the election could be affected. And American voters tune in very late, so I don't know the answer to that. And anyone who tells you that he or she knows the answer is not telling you the truth.
Okay. Please.
Klaus Lengefeld from GIZ Germany. My question is on the resilience on financial crisis that could come both from Eurozone but also from United States. I, as a German, have to admit that we are guilty for that crisis, because if Mr. Lehman from Germany would not have migrated in the 19th century to the United States and founded Lehman Brothers Bank, but we have the other story of Mr. Goldman, also from German origin. But the origin of that crisis, you might remember, Jane, is in 1999 when the Berne-Stiegel Act was lifted. That was the act that created a firewall between investment banking and the normal banking business. And this was interestingly under Mr. Clinton's administration. And after that, the financial sector, the financial products were so much inflated. We had, I think still we have 25 times the value of all financial products that are traded. It's 25 times the value of the world's GDP. So we still have that problem. We just seen Goldman, they are not resilient. They had this $2 or $3 million losses. My question is, this firewall that not one single bank that is investment banking can make the whole economy break. The countries here like Malaysia, like Thailand, like Indonesia, do you have that financial firewall? So if your banking and your normal economy sector is a little bit resilient against these shocks from the financial speculative world, from this investment, I would call this investment gambling, not investment banking, is it existing, or how do you, what is your strategy to make your economy resilient against these financial shocks that can come from a single bank? Thank you.
Our approach is to make sure that whilst we are expansionary in our economy, we also have to put in restraints, prudence in the things that we do. So a lot of the exotic instruments, financial instruments, they're not on. You don't do those kinds of things. So it's very important, I think, the speculative value that when people attach to a particular product, you must always relate to the real value. You know, so it's always very important to do that. We have our central bank, the governor of central bank, Tan Sri Zeti, is very, very clear that while as a country that we are expansionary in our approach, we must put prudence in the way in which we do this. I think if you look at Malaysia and quite a lot of countries, we have learned from the 1997 Asian financial crisis. That was actually a really good wake-up call to many, many countries, and the consolidation of banks that took place at that time. We also took a lot of the toxic assets, and we had to deal with them. Of course, our leader, Mahathir, took a very different approach at that time, and a lot of people said that his approach wasn't the most popular one to IMF, for example. But over the years, one would have, now looking back, that his approach it did work for us. It did take us out from that doldrums. But I think more importantly, I mean, Indonesia and Thailand, they all took all the various approaches. That learning lesson is important. And as I said before, in Malaysia, the Prime Minister just made a speech last week at Invest Malaysia. He said it quite categorically to everyone that we do not want our government debt to exceed 55% of GDP. We will borrow more money. When we borrow more money, we'll keep it under the lid. But we need to expand the economy beyond so that we can borrow more. But I think these are some of the things you need to do. I think all countries must put in place financial discipline. And if you don't have financial discipline in running an economy, then I think you get into all sorts of difficulties.
Geoff?
Yeah, I think you make a great point, Idris. Bank Negara Malaysia is a great institution. What Malaysia's done is brought a lot of cohesion together in the financial sector. The governor of BNM is effectively the financial risk officer for Malaysia. What the World Economic Forum proposed several years ago, we haven't seen moved forward on, which is the concept of country risk officers. That, I think, is still something that needs to be looked at so that risk is looked at in a holistic way, not just the financial sector.
Emir, you want to answer that question?
I guess in Indonesia's case, you know, what the government, well, Bank Indonesia in this case is doing is, I mean, financing. I mean, it's really growing. It's really increasing in terms of, you know, we sell about 9 million motorcycles a year, of which probably 90% is finance, and the government see that it's, you know, all those, how they get the financing, it's even 0% down payment. So they are quite worried about, you know, you're having all these assets, and which is not the loan to asset value, does not balance. So they just put a new regulation in terms of mortgage, car loans, motorcycle loans. They increased the down payment in terms of making sure that these loans, the loan to asset value is sustainable. Although the motorcycle industry, the car industry, and the real estate industry did not really like it, but they still do it. I think these are one of the measures that the government is doing because they look what's happening in the other side of the world and also in the crisis back in 97, 98, so they're doing it.
Next question. Yes.
Thank you. There are some risks with the recovery.
Please identify yourself.
Amin Effendi from Egon Center. There are some risks that are short in their repercussions and some that are long. Short means recovery within 6 months. Long ones in Southeast Asia, for example, I think the disaster in Myanmar in the Irrawaddy Delta, when the land becomes sort of affected by the sea and the income levels are very low, that could take 5-10 years to recover. Or a major volcano, say in the Philippines, the pyroclastic cover is very large, the income levels are very low. I think the World Bank was working on a catastrophic hedge. I don't know how far that idea or concept has gone, but it seems there are 2 steps that can be taken for the ones that have the longest effect. The first is to build infrastructure. It's difficult to predict where these things are happening, but if Holland took a step many, many years ago to protect itself because it was below the sea level, perhaps we could help some of the less developed economies around her, like Myanmar, who still has this potential risk of typhoons that would hit the Irrawaddy Delta and by far affect the most number of people for the longest time. So it's mitigation by infrastructure. Rehabilitation, I think, is an interesting concept that has been brought up by the panel, and developing funds that can help an economy recover 5 years after a major disaster could also have a bigger effect for those who are most affected because they're very poor. I think that very healthy economies in Southeast Asia, I'm not saying that Thailand has not fully recovered from its disaster, but it is in a better position. I'm just thinking about those that are perhaps have less means to either mitigate or rehabilitate. I'd appreciate your comments on this.
Geoff? Rehabilitation, mitigation?
Yeah, I think you've gone to a key issue, which is sudden death versus slow death. If you look at how we react to accidents on the road or accidents in the workplace, countries react rapidly to them. Slow deaths don't get reacted to and require a different sort of action and investment. I think the same is true of global risk, and you've articulated a slow death risk area there. How do we deal with rehabilitation? You've got to get some economic numbers put on it. You've got, you talk about the Myanmar situation and land there particularly. You've got the interesting debates about do you or don't you reintroduce mangrove swamps? What risks do you create if you try to reclaim land that is frequently inundated by the sea? There's a lot of complexity in there, which I think you've got to look to finance and the financial win in a balanced, fully risk-evaluated way to give the answers. So I'm sort of saying it's an issue, but it's not one with an easy or quick answer.
One last question. If not, Sinhara, what do you expect to be the next shock in the world's economy?
I guess if I try to respond to you in a square way, I guess the major risk we are facing right now is the possible resurgence of the stress in the European market. That is the major risk I have to say that we are facing right now. The second risk is still the oil price increase. Of course, the market has eased in recent days. But for example, the impact of the Fukushima nuclear plant issue is putting pressure on oil prices. Although the global demand itself is declining, but the oil price level is still high. So that is, and if there are some geopolitical issues coming up, then that could trigger the oil price increase further. Over the medium term, there are a few issues that we have to keep in mind. Especially in Europe, it is not the issue of banking crisis. It is the issue of growth and jobs. The serious problem that many of the European countries are facing is the poor prospect for growth and very high unemployment among the young people. In Asia, I think there is an issue related to the income inequality, the so-called inclusive growth. It is not an immediate issue, but in order to have a sound and strong growth in this region, I guess many countries are now beginning to pay more attention to the issue of the inclusive growth. And that is one of the important points that we have to keep in mind over the medium term.
Thank you. Let's give our panelists a big hand. Thank you very much for your attention.